Hi and welcome back again. This video will be discussing words for food in Hellenistic Greek. One word for food in general was hetraphe, which just meant food. A similar word that was almost synonymous is tabroma, which meant food, but could also mean bread, since bread was the main element of the ancient diet. The specific word for bread was ha'artos, and this was, again, the bulk of most people's meals. Often it was dipped in something tasty like garum, which was a fermented fish sauce, very strong tasting, or even just dipped in olive oil. Usually this was leavened bread, formed in broad, low loaves that would easily be broken apart into sections. And the bread was made of barley, if people were poorer, or wheat, if you had the money for it, because wheat was considered to produce a softer, more tasty bread. What were the other staple foods? Olives, grapes, and grain. These are the three basic commodities of the ancient economy. Grapes would be used primarily to make haoinos, wine. And you can see the resemblance between the Greek word oinos and our English word wine. The terms are actually related historically. This was the main beverage, and it was usually watered down, maybe half and half. But the alcohol that remained in the wine worked to kill bacteria in the water supply. And also the wine provided a cheap source of calories and vitamins when your only other food to speak of was grain. The other product for which olives would be used was ta elion, or olive oil. Again, most people didn't eat olive fruit, and it doesn't seem like olives were pickled very often. It was almost all used to make oil. And the oil would be, particularly for the poorest people in the populace, the main garnish for bread. So you'd have a dish of oil and dip your bread in the olive oil. This provided important dietary fats that could support manual labor. But olive oil was also important, not just for food, but also for lighting, in hygiene, really in every sector of life. We find olive oil, which explains why the Greeks often celebrated the gift of the olive tree from Athena as one of the chief gifts of the gods to humanity. There were some other common luxuries, foods that were eaten by the relatively small middle class. They weren't restricted to the tiny upper echelons of society, but they wouldn't have been eaten very often by the many poor. One of these would be haichthus, fish. Only the very wealthy ate meat regularly, but fish wasn't considered meat, and it was often affordable. Hakarpos is fruit, and a few fruits were readily enough available that they could liven up the monotonous diet of bread with different fruits in season. One of the chief was figs, also things like pomegranates and dates. Tasukon, then, is the term for fig, and this was the most common fruit for ordinary people. Not so often dried, although it could be dried and kept through the gap between fruit seasons. Some of our common foods were only used as seasonings or ingredients. Tagala is milk. Milk wasn't used for drinking, and it doesn't seem like the Greeks or Romans knew butter. Instead, milk was consumed almost entirely as cheese. Tahudor, which we think of as the basic drink, was drunk much less than wine by itself, and it was important instead for things like making bread. Even ordinary people wanted to flavor their food, and we're not alone as a modern society in enjoying foods that are either sweet or salty. So we often read about tameli, which was honey. And this could either have been honey produced by bees, or it could refer to any kind of syrup produced from fruit or plants, things like a date syrup or date honey. But whatever kind of honey it was, this was the main source of sweetening that people had. There was very little access to anything like our refined sugar. On the other hand, we read about tahalas, salt. And interestingly, this is a variant in Hellenistic Greek of the more common Greek term ha-hals. Both are just words for salt, but one, ha-hals, is masculine, and the neuter term ta-halas seemed to just be a variant using a different gender of the same word. In any case, salt was used widely in making bread. It was used as a preservative for things like fish and meat, and especially in the fermented fish sauce that was used as a common condiment for even poor people. Even greens, green leafy vegetables, when they were eaten, were often soaked first in salt. We sometimes exaggerate just how valuable salt was in the ancient world. It was certainly valuable, but valuable primarily because it was used by most people all the time. Anybody who was farming, anyone who was doing hard labor, would need a fairly significant intake of salt from some source in order to be able to continue working. Salt was usually produced in the Roman world in big evaporation pans, like the ones in the picture here. Either evaporation would happen just by sunlight naturally, or if you were in a more temperate climate in the Roman Empire, large wood-fired pans were used to heat brine or salt water in order to evaporate off the water and leave behind the relatively pure salt. But the elite enjoyed an enormous variety of foods. A lot of foods that we now take for granted. Tokreas was the term for meat. This would only be available to the masses during festivals when the sacrificial animals would be sacrificed at the temple, and only a small part of the animal would be burned on the altar. The rest of, and most of the good cuts of meat would be divided up, cooked, and then distributed to the populace. Birds, like pigeon and pheasant, were more available, although still tended to be restricted to the upper class. On the other end of our food guide, we find talachanon, or vegetable. This includes herbs, leafy greens, root vegetables, and in cities was not part of most people's diet at all. It was, though, included in the elaborate dishes of the wealthy, and you would find vegetables included both as the core of some dishes and more often as garnishes. Interestingly, the diet of rural people, of poorer people who were farming the land, often as tenant farmers or slaves, the diet of those people tended to be better, more nutritious, because it would include a lot more of the fresh vegetables that people would have access to in kitchen gardens. So, where does all this food come from? If we think about the origins of wine, wine, of course, comes from pressed grapes, and the grapes grow on he ampelos, the grapevine. This is an odd word if you look carefully, because you'll notice that it has the feminine definite article, he, along with a word ampelos that ends in what looks like a masculine second declension ending. And in fact, this is a second declension noun, but it's feminine in gender. Now, you won't have to worry about this very often. There are just a few second declension nouns that are feminine in gender, just because there have to be exceptions to every rule. But that means that in all of its cases, ampelos will take endings that look just like the masculine second declension endings. The genitive, for example, will be u, omicron upsilon. But in every case, you'll need to use the feminine definite article with it. And when we get into using adjectives that have to agree with the noun in gender, those adjectives will take a feminine form. The real gender of heampelos is feminine, even though the endings are typically masculine second declension endings. Now, when we have a whole bunch of grapevines growing together in a plantation, this is referred to as an ampelone, vineyard. Many of the fruits that were common food items in the first century grew on trees, and one of the words for tree is todendron. Another standard word for tree is toxulon, and sometimes toxulon can refer not to the tree as a plant, but to the material it's grown from, to the wood. So xulon is often used as a euphemism for a cross, and sometimes you'll see references to Jesus being nailed to the tree that's using this word xulon, and it could be translated instead as Jesus being nailed to the wood, referring to the actual material of the cross. Hesuke is the fig tree, and this is the source of tasukon, the fig. So the feminine word is the tree, the source, and the product is neuter, tasukon, And this is a pattern that we're going to see in a couple of words where the plant that produces something is feminine and the neuter form of the same word is the product. So we have he elaya, which again is feminine, and this is the olive tree, or in this case can also be the olive fruit. It's ambiguous whether this is the tree or the fruit. And I think that's in part because the product of the olive tree isn't actually the fruit. The product is the olive oil. Remember, people aren't eating olives as fruit. They're using olives to produce olive oil. And so the neuter form, ta elayon, means olive oil. Meals in the ancient world tended to be eaten lying down, reclining around a common low table, usually a small platform. People would recline on benches, like in the photograph here, or would sit on the floor around it. And the table would hold common dishes of food. Each person would have their own portions of bread, perhaps, but then would dip it in common dishes of olive oil or garum or whatever other garnishes were available. Interestingly, the word hetrapeza for table was the root of our English word trapezoid. The noon meal or lunch was called ta ariston, and it wasn't usually a sit-down meal at home. It was often eaten on the go, and there were common snack bars in towns that would serve a little bit of bread with garum or a little bit of some sort of stew. Ta deipnon was dinner or an evening meal, and this would be the main meal of the day, often the only sit-down meal that people would enjoy. The wealthy often made ta deipnon into a time of entertainment with music, with dancers, with readings from various poets or epics, and the deipnon of the rich could last right through the whole evening and late into the night. Thanks for watching. I'm Ian Scott, and I'm Associate Professor of New Testament Studies at Tyndale Seminary. We're a trans-denominational graduate school of theology in Toronto, Canada. This video was produced as part of my web app called Paideia, an interactive space for learning the Hellenistic Greek of the New Testament and other early Jewish and Christian writings, as well as the whole Hellenistic world. If you haven't tried out Paideia, you can find the app at learngreek.ca/Paideia. You can find the whole playlist of my Greek videos by clicking the link here. And if you appreciate free learning resources like this, don't forget to click the like button below and subscribe to my channel.